And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome to the last webinar of the Future of Central Banking series. This webinar today is on structural change. As you know, this is part of a series of webinars on the first book of a 10-book series on central banking and monetary policy that I am co-editing with Guillaume Vallet and Silvio Capes. Silvio could not be here with us this morning. Today we have two presentations, and one of them will be a little bit late. The second presenter has currently a meeting, and she will join us very soon. The first presentation is by Cristina Mello from Brazil, along with Polo Robiotti, and the second will be by Daniela Prates. And she'll join us once her meeting is done. So as usual, I remind you to please mute yourselves. And we will begin with the first presentation. And I believe Cristina Mello will be presenting. She'll be sharing a video, a PowerPoint. And she'll have approximately 25 minutes, maybe a little bit more, a little bit less, to present the paper. Cristina, whenever you're ready, please unmute yourself and share your PowerPoint.
Thank you, Rochon. It's a great pleasure to be here with you again. And these are some thoughts that we want to share with you, is to discuss just a little bit. I am a part of a new developmentalism group with Professor Bresser Pereira, a former minister in Brazil, and what we are going to share some thoughts in the new developmentalism approach. So, okay. We have some beliefs about exchange rate and the role of central banks that we would think about it. So, exchange rate must move according to fundamentals, capital flow. Most of Brazilians believe that exchange rate must float. And the balance of payment rationality for intervention in trade movements would disappear, is something that we are thinking, especially in the case of China with the rate superiority. So the rationality of the system was thought not for poor economic countries, even developing countries. Currency must be offered, money supply normally look to inflation and unemployment rate according to Phillips curve. And the rules for money supply could decline or lower the power of central banks. So this is something that we think is a question not of the best economic policy design, but it's about power and politics. So the discussion about central bank independence is not really an economic issue, it's all about power. In that way, we think it's not only power inside the country, but power outside the country also. Targeting inflation could lead prices and exchange rate to purchase power equilibrium. We have plenty of data that shows us that targeting inflation, exchange rate can float with free floats and no limits to capital flow can guarantee a PPP as a result. So the purchase power parity theory tells us that the relative price movements in domestic and foreign goods are the essential determining factor of the exchange rate. In that way, would provide information enough to allocate resources and guarantee full employment. The argument for quantitative easing policies option is about domestic needs. No one talks about the impact on exchange rate and consequences for developing countries. Instead of discussions about PPP, we must discuss CPP, or competition power parity. Central banks must target international competition to avoid industrialization and deficits in balance of payments. In Brazil, it is a kind of example that I show to my students to see that if you have, for example, this exchange rate, 1 per 1, it's real per dollar, and you have a huge competitiveness and natural resources that can guarantee that the average costs in reais for producers in primary goods, agriculture, or minerals, for example, and you have an international price of $100 because it's a commodity, you will have an average revenue in reais about 100 reais, and the profit margin will be 60. If you are a manufacturer producer, you have a price, international price of 100 just to compare it. But if you have an average cost that's higher because of the competitivity, you don't have the advantage of natural resources like this, and you have an exchange rate 1 per 1, an average revenue, you will have a lower profit margin of 20. If you let the exchange rate to appreciate, so you will have a 7 reais per dollar, cents per dollar. In the case of the agriculture, for example, you will have an average revenue of 70, but you will still have a positive profit margin. But in the case of manufacturing, you will have a negative profit margin. So if you don't look to exchange rate, we will have structural changes, severe structural changes. In the case of Brazil, a huge deindustrialization. So we always thought about investment decision to react to interest rate, to domestic interest rates. Research with entrepreneurs in Brazil, big ones, pointed that carry trade operations could be an option to local credit restrictions and high capital costs, but medium firms and small firms has huge internal market constraints to finance themselves. So exchange rates matter to achieve international markets, to avoid unfair competition in domestic markets, and because of finance motive. We largely consider the effect of currency hierarchy, reserve money supply, and the action of the most important central banks in a new exchange rate equilibrium that could change investment decisions and conduct economies to the industrialization like Brazil. The topics we think we must face is neutrality consensus in longer run is about inflation, not about competition. We are playing in an unlevered field. What we really know about transmission mechanism, how can central bank guarantee development when they design monetary policy? The role of institutions and behavior matter. Are they the key factors to explain the non-monetary policy transmission mechanism? Behavior economics shows that there's a great probability of misbehavior in short run, and even in the long run. But it's a question if we learn something with misbehavior. But in that way, what do we know about behavior? We always think in rationality, in maximization, optimization, but behavior economics is telling us that we need to study a little bit more about that. Experimental economics also points out that we should test policy options before implementing them, culture, institutions, and behavior matters. Can central banks target competition? What about the constraints, the limits? What about countries in lower positions in the currency hierarchy, like in Brazil? We are always facing the trade-off between deindustrialization or inflation. So can be public banks an alternative to this trade-off? So in that point, Paulo will start to talk about public banks. So the main conclusions is there is no reason to claim that money supply is neutral in terms of resources allocation. Liquidity preferences are strongly attached to bond markets. Institutional differences between bond markets across the world implies a monetary hierarchy. The hierarchy puts constraints, limits to domestic economic policy. And thinking in equilibrium and about an ideal world with ideal behavior blind us to see the effects in production complexity, development, and inequality across countries. So, Paulo, are you here? I think we lost Paulo. No, he's muted.
If Paulo...
Sorry. I'm here. Christina, okay for you to move or you prefer?
Yes. No, just order and I do that.
Okay, I want to see your... Oh. So as Christina pointed about the whole of institutions in an economy, I will stress a little bit about the institutional design here in Brazil. Okay, so I will discuss a little about our institutional, bank institutional design, particularly the importance of public banks in order to provide credit and structural change in the Brazilian economy. Traditionally, the financial system has three aspects, three functions. The first function is to provide credit in order to expand the relations between all the agents in the economy. I'm not sure if
Yes, Polo, I don't think we can hear you properly. You have to unmute yourself. Okay, now speak. Yeah, we can't hear you. We cannot ask.
Sean, you can unmute him, I think.
Yeah, I can only ask him to unmute.
Okay.
Oh, just now.
Perfect. This is better.
Can you hear now? Because it's a message here telling me that your speaker is not working and I really don't know why.
We can hear you.
Okay, so move on. I'm saying here that traditionally in advanced economies, the financial system developed three functions. The first one to provide credit, the second one to ensure liquidity with financial assets. And by doing this, allowing the intermediation of capital transfer. And the third one, and the most important, the financial system has the whole to support the real accumulation.
Yes, Polo, I think we're having difficulties again.
Yes. I'm trying to connect with my mobile in order to overcome this problem. Just one moment, please, and I'll leave this message, this meeting here.
So if you want, Paulo, I can tell them something while you are trying to. So this figure can show us that the participation of public banks in Brazil in the credit supply is really great. So it's almost 50% some years. In some years, in the beginning of the 90s, you can see they were really higher. And the foreign control is really small in Brazil. So why public banks can be so crucial for Brazilian economy? So, sorry, I can't see that now.
Hear
Public
me?
banks, oh yes, now we are hearing.
Okay. So I connected through the mobile. Christina, okay, so I don't know what you mentioned, but what's important to have clear is that when we talk about structural change in Brazil, we're talking about public banks. And the third function of the financial system whole in the advanced economies is not watched in the developing countries. The private financial system cannot support the real accumulation process in a proper way. Particularly in Brazil, this hole is filled by the state-owned banks. In this graph, we can see in the blue bars the share of public banks in all our financial system. We're talking about a proportion that goes from 1/3 to 2/3 of the credit market. Can you put the next one, Christina, please? According to the literature, why public banks is so crucial for us? The first aspect is that they promote economic and regional development. And by doing this, they support the industrial, rural, and real estate segments with long-term loans. And this is such a credit modality which private banks operate here only marginally. Is the state that offer historically these branch of the market. The second one, public banks act with counter-cyclical performance of the credit supply, so they are crucial in hard moments of economy, such as after the 2008 crisis. And the third one, they contribute to integrate low-income population into the banking system. So public banks serve to finance activities that may not otherwise be supported by the private financial system sector. Can you, Christina, please? And here, taking a look about the share, the evolution of the share of the credit outstanding under public control, we can identify 4 moments over last decades. In the 90s, we are watching a liberalization and financial opening process. And during that process, government-owned banks reduced dramatically their share in the Brazilian credit market, moving from 70% to 1/3 over the 90s. After that, in the following 8 years, with corresponded to the first administration of Lula, public participation in the credit remained stable until the last great financial crisis. From that moment on until mid-2016, we watched an increase in the public participation in the credit here, almost doubling their size. But after Dilma's impeachment, what happened was an inflection of this direction. And the credit outstanding under public control has been continuously reducing its participation by 10 percentage points in a short period of time. The last data here is of April of this year. Next, please, Christina. Despite of this reduction of the public banks' participation in the market, the public banks still represent the main players in the supply of credit. And just to be clear, for the non-Brazilians here, when we are talking about public banks, we are talking about mainly 3 of them. Caixa Econômica Federal, which is a federal bank, and a purely state-owned bank. The second one is Banco do Brasil, or Bank of Brazil, which is mixed private and public bank, but such bank is under public control, despite being operating with association with the private market. And last one is BNDES, which is the National Economic and Social Development Bank in Brazil. According to the last data of central bank, can you move back, Christina? Just thank you. Caixa Econômica and Banco do Brasil represent 1/3 of all credit in Brazil, and BNDES represent 80%. Another 3 big players, private big players, which is Itaú Bank, Bradesco, and Santander Brazil, represents together these 3 almost of the 2 biggest state-controlled banks do. Can you, Christina, please? But having a look in the credit for households, Caixa Econômica and Banco do Brasil, together, they represent 50% of all credit destined to families here in Brazil. And if we consider the real estate credit, Caixa Econômica Federal represents about 70%. So Caixa Econômica and also Banco do Brasil, but mainly Caixa Econômica, contributes both for the construction sector, which has a very high income multiplier, and also for the reduction of the housing deficit in Brazil, which is a drama here. And by doing this, Caixa Econômica also reduces financial vulnerability of low-income families. And we are talking about here, again, long-term loans, okay? And next one, Christina, please. And about the corporative credit for companies. We have BNDES as the key player, followed by other two public banks, Banco do Brasil and Caixa Econômica Federal. And they together, again, represent almost half of all credit destined to companies. So government, the federal government, is crucial for providing funding credit for companies. Taking a look only about BNDES, which matters the most for us here, about the structural change. Until we can decompose here in 3 moments again. The first one is until 2008. We watch here an increase in the disbursement resulted in the shy improvement of the economic perspective in Brazil. But the golden age of BNDES took place between 2009 and 2014, when it occurred heavy industrial and infrastructure investments conducted by the government under the accelerated growth program. And after that, after 2014, we are watching a reduction both in the disbursement of BNDES and also in the importance of BNDES to finance our development. And today we are operating, we have a BNDES operating in a lower level than it did during the 90s. And 90s wasn't a time that we were watching, we were not carrying on about development. We're taking about stabilizing our economy. So it's a regression, a very deep regression. Next one, please, Christina. And about the destination of BNDES credit or disbursement, we have a big hole destinated by the large companies here in Brazil. And when we are talking about these big companies, we are talking about infrastructure and also exports. BNDES is a very important institution to help in the internationalization of Brazilian companies. Okay. So, but as we can see, in the last 3 years, there has been a growth in the median, a growth in participation of the medium size companies. And this is happening because as we will see in the following slides, the resources funding of BNDES is majority from taxes, from Treasury, Brazilian National Treasury. And after Dilma's impeachment, we changed it here. We wanted a change in the economic view, moving for a much more liberalization. And in this context, the participation of BNDES has been tackled, has been criticized by saying that they are, BNDES is helping who doesn't need to be helped, which is the big companies. So we wanted an increase in the participation of medium companies through these, after these critiques. Can you go, Christina? And when we talk, when we have a look about the quality of BNDES operation, we have two indicators here, very important. The first one is the default rate. BNDES operate with a very low delinquency or default rate compared to other segments. The non-earned market funds here, roughly speaking, is the private credit in the orange line. And in the green line, we can say, roughly speaking, again, that is more public banks, Caixa Econômica and Bank of Brazil. And BNDES has a lower default registration, even considered even for the public standard, okay, the public credit standard. And in addition to that, BNDES operates with a very Basel index. While Central Bank of Brazil demand 10% of Basel index, BNDES in the last data, according to Central Bank of Brazil, operated with around 36% of Basel index. Can you go, Christina, please? And there is a strong correlation between BNDES operation through disbursement and investment in Brazil. I don't know if you can see the green point in the graph represents the year, the last year, 2019. And investment remain historically in the lowest level, as long as BNDES operation is also in the lowest level since the 90s. So how can we think about structural change under this context? How can we think about development under this context? Here is the sources of BNDES. The PIS/PASEP, it's a compulsory fund, workers' compulsory savings that government established by constitution, that these funds has to be destinated for an institution who creates jobs, such as BNDES. So tax composes a very important part of the resources of BNDES. And the second most important is the National Treasury credit apportionment for BNDES. And through over the golden age, the BNDES golden age, from 2009 to 2016, national treasury resource designated to BNDES increased a lot. But since then, and allied with another vision of development of economy, of the participation of state in the economy, the destination, the treasury destination funds for BNDES has been reducing continuously, as we can see in the right graph. Next one, please. In conclusions, so here, due to the institutional reforms that took place here in Brazil from 1903 to 2003 to 2005, Brazil has increased a lot after this moment, the credit supply. But such reforms didn't reduce the dependence on public banks, which, as I mentioned, represents something between 150%, one third and 50% of our credit. So public banks can potentialize monetary policy here in Brazil, as occurred in 19 onwards. However, at times, public banks go in the opposite direction from the Brazilian central bank, as happened in 2012 and 2013. And this reduces the effectiveness of monetary policy and generates distortions when central banks raise interest rates, but public banks increase their participation, offer more credit. So we have opposite directions in the monetary policy. And the extreme case about this, to illustrate this, occurred in 2014, when central bank was raising interest rate while public banks continued to expand credit. The participation of BND, the importance and the size of BNDES has been receiving enormous critiques and about the fiscal costs of such operations, and they decided to rethink BNDES, and nowadays BNDES doesn't offer credit in a subsidized interest rate. Now we have a volatile and procyclical rate. And by doing this, BNDES has lost much of its attraction under risk aversion moments. Okay, so today BNDES is unable to act counter-cyclically, as well as provide economic development. This is our presentation, and stressing the importance of institution in order to potentialize and dribble and, how can I say, to overcome some limits imposed by the currency hierarchy. It's this. I cannot hear.
Yeah, thank you, Polo. Christina, if you can remove the Yeah, there you go. Thank you very much for this, for your presentation, to you and to Christina. We will move ahead with some questions. If anyone has some questions, please, I'm not as prolific uh, as, um, as was Silvio with this. So if you do have a question, please unmute yourself and just ask your question.
Well, I have a question actually.
And who are you? Just introduce yourself.
It's me, Mehmet. Do you see me?
Perfect. Yeah. Thank you.
Mehmet.
Yes.
So if you are hear me, and I'm going to ask my question.
Yes, please.
Okay, thank you very much for the presentation, Paulo and Cristina. It was really interesting. My question is that, especially in the last part, in the conclusion, Paulo said that when the central bank actually increased the interest rates, the public bank does not respond to this monetary policy of the central bank. I was wondering that, did you see the banking performance, I mean the profitability of the banking sector differently from the private sector and the public sector? Because if you think about the public bank, they operate in a different way in terms of profitability with the private sector. So they are not in a way that sensitive much with the cost of credit. And maybe it's something different. I was wondering, did you see the difference between the private bank's profitability and the public bank profitability?
Polo, you got to unmute yourself.
Yes, Paulo.
Christina, you can help me because I know you know this. But the profitability of the private bank's profitability here in Brazil is much higher than the public. Bank of Brazil is a different case because it's mixed. There are private capital, so they have to offer results for the investors. But we traditionally, private banks in Brazil, how can I say, the core business is not offering credit, but is with treasury operations. While Caixa Econômica and Banco do Brasil traditionally are more active in the supply of credit. I would say that. I don't know, Christina, what you think about it.
Well, if we think about Bank do Brasil, Bank of Brazil, since they have, they are in the stock market, they have the same profitability as the private banks, because they have a lot of strategies to have this profitability. And if you look to Caixa Econômica Federal, they have lower, but they are the public hands to public policies. So I don't think we must look to the profitability of the Caixa Econômica Federal. And the BNDES, since 90s, they have tried many strategies to have the same profitability that are very interesting ones. The way they act as in the stock market and between the enterprises and through the private banks, it's a mixed combination. So they are not, they have a good profitability. Not like the private banks, of course, but they have good ones. Paulo?
About this, I remembered over the financial crisis, a way in which, for example, Banco do Brasil used to
higher its share in the private market was reducing spread rates. And by doing that, Banco do Brasil, how can I say, invited the private banks to follow it in the reduction, in the spread reduction, but it wasn't sustainable. And the spread returned to high levels. But is this, I agree, is not so far. Banco do Brasil is not so far from Itaú, Bradesco, and Santander, but it's a little bit lower, the profitability, a little bit lower.
Thank you. Does anyone else have a question? Again, unmute yourself and introduce yourself, please.
Can I say something more? Sorry, David, Mehmet. Is that another thing that we must think, because the BNDES act through the private banks. The risk of this operation is with the private banks. So even with the lower profitability, they don't have risks. So it's a kind of compensation. Okay, so sorry. David, please.
Thank you, both of you, for your presentation. Christina, I'd like to ask, and Paulo is also welcome to answer, to clarify your argument about development and the exchange rate. You began by saying that, and making a very strong case that has been made in development economics about the relationship of the exchange rate to deindustrialization even, but through investment. I really would like to know, what is the pathway that you are seeing here? Is the pathway from investment through credit, through the interest rate? And the different, like at the structural level, because deindustrialization is a structural issue, I'd like to know more precisely how you see the structural impacts of the change in the exchange rate, particularly in the case of Brazil, but I'm interested in the issue more generally in economic development. So could you clarify your model or your theory about the relationship of the exchange rate to deindustrialization? Thank you.
I'll try to do so, and Paul can help me. At first, David, I thought that the exchange rate was just another price, and we can choose between external market and domestic market to invest. But this, I looked more specifically to this point, and I have talked a lot with a lot of entrepreneurs in Brazil. I thought there's something different that we are not seeing, and I try to clarify that. When you have a very appreciated exchange rate, like in Brazil, you cannot access domestic market, even external market. So it's not a kind of choice between, okay, let's do something to exports or let's do something to the domestic market. It's just, there is no perspective for selling in the domestic market, because outside products comes in with a very low price, so you can't compete inside your country. And even you can't sell outside. So I was talking with an entrepreneur, a manager. I don't remember the name, the firm you visited, Paulo, during the SGBET, do you remember? It's Schultz.
Schuller.
Schuller is a firm that machinery and equipment firm in Brazil, but she's a branch of a huge firm in Germany. And the manager told us that they have more productivity in Brazil than in Germany, but they can go outside Brazil with the same price as Germany, not because of taxes or because of salaries, wages, but because of the exchange rate. So I thought that is something here. Let's study a little bit more. So it's about that we are talking about. Exchange rate is, when it's just a little bit appreciated, it's not really a problem, but huge appreciation, chronic appreciation, historic appreciation changes the productive structure.
Thank you very much. Does anyone, Paolo, do you have a comment? No. Okay. One more question, if there is one, then we'll go to the second presenter. Does anyone have a question? With that in mind, then we'll go to the next presentation, which is by Daniela Prates, who has joined us.
Hi.
Hello.
Hello.
And, I will ask her to, there you go, there you are. So Daniela, you have about 30 minutes to present. And if you do have a presentation, please share it with us.
Thank you. So I will let you know when you should change this.
Oh, great.
Will be better if I could change, but I will let you know. Now, so the change, because the original title was Inflation Target and the Structural Change, the Brazil Experience. So I added the currency hierarchy, inflation target, and the structural change. And so I will explain why. I don't know why I hadn't included in the first title. And then the co-authors will be Carolina Trancoso Baltari and Rosângela Ballini. Paulo, you could. Okay, so the main question that we would like to answer is how the exchange rate dynamic has affected the manufacturing GDP in Brazil and jeopardized structural change since the adoption of the inflation target regime in 1999. So I will detail a little the model, but so we will cover the period. So 1999 to 2019. And the hypothesis is that the position of the Brazilian currency at the lower level of the currency hierarchy of the international monetary system result in a cyclical and volatile behavior of the exchange rate under the inflation target regime that has an asymmetrical, is effect, a typo here, as asymmetrical effect in the manufacturing GDP in the appreciation and depreciation phases of the capital flows cycles. Then what we would like to show is that, briefly, under inflation targeting regime, Brazil and all countries that adopt the inflation target adopt a floating exchange rate regime. But indeed, all emerging market countries adopt a dirty floating, exactly because the higher volatility and vulnerability of their currencies to the capital flow cycles, because their currencies are not as international currencies, are not accepted at the international level. And so about this discussion of currency hierarchy and exchange rate dynamics, I have already worked on that. I have some papers published, but I have never had the opportunity to link this discussion to structural change. So it's really, I thank Luis Felipe, Sergio for this opportunity, and why this issue and this question? Because from many years, I work with exchange rate regime in Brazil, but mainly before the global financial crisis, what happened? Appreciation, for many years of appreciation, linked with, sure, the boom of capital flows, but also to the management of the inflation target regime in Brazil that result in a high interest rate differential, and that fostered even more the currency appreciation that was fundamental for the achievement of the inflation target. But what at the other side, this foster also the industrialization process of the Brazilian economy that has started already in the 90s in the context of the managed exchange rate regime that related of the stabilization plan, the real plan. Then this, since that time, so many years ago, I have this issue, but I have never had the opportunity. Then I would like only to detail how we will organize the arguments in this chapter. And so, Paulo, please, could you change? Okay. So the chapter will have 4 sections. So the first section will be the discussion, the more general discussion about the relationship of the currency hierarchy and the inflation targeting in emerging market economies, such as Brazil. And because what happened, exactly what I have already said, because of the greater exchange rate volatility and the higher pass-through between exchange rate variation and the inflation in emerging market economies, these economies need to adopt a dirty floating exchange rate regime. Then we don't have what the theoretical model of inflation target of the new macroeconomic consensus suggested, or that if you have inflation target, you have floating exchange rate regime and monetary policy autonomy. But this doesn't happen in emerging market economies. And what happened is that to attain the inflation target, the monetary policy need also to not target, but need to manage the exchange rate, because if the exchange rate depreciates, the inflation goes up and the inflation target that is not reached. Then we have in emerging market economies interrelation, a very strong interrelation between the exchange rate policy and the monetary policy. And what we observed in Brazil and other emerging market countries like Mexico, Turkey, that the nominal appreciation, the central banks search a nominal appreciation to attain the inflation target. And this also, but as I mentioned already, at the other side, this has a very negative impact on the productive side of the economy. And in Brazil, what happened, the industrialization means recommoditization of our exports and of our productive side. Then in this session, we'll summarize this discussion economies. And the second session, we will present the main features of the inflation target in Brazil And the idea I'm calling here the phases of the inflation target, because we have, in these phases are very linked with the capital flows cycle phases. And one important question that maybe when I was preparing the presentation, I thought someone could come with these questions. Now, what is happening? The Brazilian currency is depreciating, and the central bank cut the interest rate. Indeed, but why this is possible? So in this moment, to reach the inflation target, the depreciation is a good thing, because the inflation is below the target because of the recession and now the COVID-19 crisis. So we have then different degrees of monetary policy autonomy because of the dynamic of the international economy, given the peripheral position of these economies in the international economy. Next, Paulo. Then here, so the third and the fourth, and mainly the fourth section that Carolina is works with industry performance, manufacturing performance in Brazil. Her PhD thesis with Philip Arestes in Cambridge was exactly about inflation target and manufacturing production in Brazil, is exactly why I invited her. And what will be really the contribution of our paper to use a new method. I will talk about it in the sequence that will show this asymmetric effect of a currency appreciation and a currency depreciation in the GDP, manufacturing GDP performance in Brazil. Then what happened? When the currency appreciated, we know that this has a negative effect on exports and stimulate imports. But imports can be investment. So this could be a positive side of currency appreciation. But imports of final goods are a negative side of the currency appreciation. And Caroline has her PhD thesis in other, also empirical studies, have shown that a favorable international scenario, and because of this scenario and the interest rate differential, what happened? The exchange rate channel is the most important channel of the monetary policy in Brazil, and as I mentioned, is key to the achievement of the inflation target. And at this context of appreciation, this increase the purchase power of the population. So we note in Brazil, there are moments of appreciation with increase of the manufacturing production. But when this happens, it only reinforces the existing productivity capacity of the Brazil economy. So the sectors where Brazil has already competitiveness. So these moments of appreciation, we could see increase GDP, manufactured GDP, but without a structural change, or even worse, with a step back, with a reduction, yes, I stepped back in the structural change process. So Paulo, could you? And other important thing that is missing. And during the depreciation, this is the thing. that we would like to measure. The appreciation has a greater effect than the depreciation. Why the depreciation now, for instance, or even 2011, 2012, why the depreciation hasn't stimulated the GDP manufacturing? Because of the industrialization, and also because of this happened in a not favorable, unfavorable international context. So the puzzle and the really problem of the Brazilian economy now is that the depreciation hasn't the effect that we would expect of stimulate the GDP manufacturing. But how to measure this asymmetry? Then of this asymmetry between exchange rate and the manufactured GDP when the currency is appreciated or is depreciated. So the idea is that there might have a non-linearity on this effect. The currency depreciation does not seem enough to stimulate manufacturing production, as I mentioned, because it reflects the negative international scenario, and also because the industrialization, or like some authors prefer, the regressive specialization process. We will use this method, the Markov switching vector autoregression, that is called the MSVAR. That is a model that belongs to a more general class of models that characterize a non-linear data generating process. And with this method, we will define two, because this method uses the idea of regimes. So we will define the two kinds of regimes in Brazil that vary according to the international liquidity cycle phases. And up to now, we didn't find a paper that use this method to answer, to analyze this question. So this is the idea of the chapter. Then where we stand now, the first, second, and third sections are already, we are already not, we don't have a finished them, but they are already very advanced. And the only the estimation that we will need more time to finish, because it's not is really a new method for that Rosângela and Carol are so working with. So is this that I would like to share with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniela. The PowerPoint will come down.
Okay, I hope I managed to present the ideas.
Yes, thank you very much. Now, let's go to some questions. If anyone has some questions, please, again, unmute yourself and please ask your question. Scrolling down the list. So let me, oh, Mario has a question, but let me just ask my question since I was, your section 2 on inflation targeting. I know there have been a couple of papers there in the post-Keynesian heterodox literature. I'm thinking in particular of Setterfield, who has argued that inflation targeting can be consistent with a post-Keynesian theory. I'm rather critical of the concept. So in that section, just in general, are you saying that the Central Bank of Brazil should inflation target, or are you in favor of a completely different policy framework?
Mm-hmm. Nice to the question. I agree with you. I really, for me, I couldn't understand how inflation target could be compatible with post-Keynesian approach. I totally agree with you. The idea of these two sections, the first and the second one, will be more, the idea was not to present an alternative approach. But my idea, I didn't mention, but it's that we could do that in the conclusions, because the first section will be this more general, but I will criticize the use, especially, so inflation target is for me a problem also for developed, advanced economies,
Yes.
but it's even more problematic for emerging market economies, developing economies. So this I will emphasize in the first section, and in the second section for Brazil. So how in Brazil we have the inflation target, this has this negative effect on structural change. And I think that after the econometric estimation at the conclusion, we could discuss what would be an alternative macroeconomic regime, because we need to think about the exchange rate, the monetary and the fiscal policies together. Because as we know, the discussions is like the exchange rate, if you look at in the mainstream, and even some post-Keynesian, no, but mainly mainstream, the exchange rate policy is never mentioned. But why? Because this is a problem for our countries that has this position in the currency hierarchy and has higher volatility of exchange rate, that has external constraints. So I think this is and even for the book of central banking, because the central bank is not only responsible for monetary policy, but also for exchange rate policy. And we need a coordination in the case of emerging market economies. So I think this would be nice to discuss.
I agree, but don't you have Brazilians? I'm thinking of Franklin
UFRJ,
Franklin Ciano, who questions the link between interest rates and exchange rate, doesn't he?
Yes, and they show, they have also papers, and I will refer to them, that shows this role of the exchange rate channel in the monetary policy transmission in Brazil. So they also have, so what I think in this section of section 2 on the inflation target in Brazil, there are huge literature.
Yeah.
And so we use this literature. I think it's in the contribution, I think in related with that, we would not have, I think, contribution. Really, maybe we don't have a new thing to say. But I think in this first section, I think that we will have this discussion more general, that between the currency hierarchy, exchange rate, inflation target. So this is an issue that we don't have many papers on that. And in the second session, will be more this, we summarize the inflation target in Brazil, and we have this moment, that this not 2020, but even before, we have this new situation of the central bank could cut the interest rate because the depreciation is not, the inflation is low because of the recession. And so
we've got two questions, Mario Sequerecia and then Christina, and then David Ledbeater, if I saw correctly. Mario?
Hi, yes, Daniela, thank you very much for the presentation. I do, however, have a simple question as I listened to you. When you talked about the asymmetry in the way in which the exchange rate impacted, the appreciation versus the depreciation over that 20-year period or whatever that you're referring to there. I just couldn't help thinking, well, I mean, surely if you include China kind of thing in the picture here, wouldn't you be concerned about studying what was the composition of your manufacturing exports to understand perhaps why there could have been a symmetry here? Needless to say, if you like the time that Brazil went, engaged in inflation targeting, happens to coincide more or less with when China joined the World Trade Organization, and obviously, as that country, opened up, so to speak, there, certain countries, including here in Canada, of course, we were all being affected by that. And certain sectors of the economy were badly damaged as a result of that. That may have, in a sense, much less to do with the exchange rate issue, okay, than just simply the fact that you have another player there who could undercut any other country practically at the time. And the fact that you depreciate and you don't see that effect, moving in the opposite direction, that there is an asymmetry, again, may have a lot to do with that. I mean, I don't know what the answer is, except that you cannot abstract from that.
Sure. No, I totally, I only, because my battery is, I totally agree with you. And indeed, what happened, for coincidence, I have some papers with Carolina, and that shows how, because before the global financial crisis, China, Brazilian exports competitiveness also have been affected by China. But this effect is even worse after the global financial crisis, because Brazil had a higher share in Latin America countries, imports, of manufacturing imports. And after the global financial crisis, because of the lower global growth and the greater pressure from China, so we show in these papers how Brazilian share has been decreasing. So I agree with you. We will need to talk about China competitiveness. But the thing is that I think we couldn't disregard the exchange rate role. But in my opinion, is much more the problem of before the global financial crisis. Because what happened is China increasing competitiveness and our currency appreciating. So I think that this is a huge discussion in Brazil, because many has this opinion. No, the problem is not the currency appreciating or depreciating, but China. But we need also to remember that we have the import side. So the appreciation is not only a problem for exports, but for imports, so net exports. So if you let the currency appreciate, what this result in invasion of imports, and this also foster the industrialization. So I think is really the combination of these factors. So the macroeconomic regime, China, and the international context. So it's sure the global value chain, the global value chains, because also Brazil, how Brazil has engaged in this. So it's really, I think, it's combination of factors that explain this Brazil, the industrialization and the how you say, the impossibility to foster in structural change.
Could I just add one thing, which is that there's also the period of high primary commodity prices.
Yes.
That effect also, it's like the curse again, the resource curse, or the Dutch disease in our case and all that. This is all happening during that period before the global financial crisis.
Yes, yes, exactly.
And you're getting the same kind of effects here that also are intervening and impacting on that. I'm sorry, but I'm just saying that there are things going on at that time that are rather important to mention. Yeah.
Yes, no, sure. When in this section about the inflation targeting, we would need to consider all these phases and the international context. You're totally right. It's not only the capital flows boom, but we have the commodity price boom. And so these two twin booms I refer to, that result in the currency appreciation. But from my point of view, and also based on my studies, the financial dimension is more important than the commodity price booms in the sense that I think I have a paper with Kevin Gallagher about that we call the financialization of the research course, because the commodity prices also affected the Brazilian currency through the financial side, through bets in the derivative markets. It's not mainly on the export surplus. We have this effect, but we have also this, is why we call financialization, because of the commodity boom, the bets on the appreciation increased, not only because the difference, the interest rate differential. So we have this reinforced, these two factors.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
We will take two questions, one from Christina and then David Ledbeater. Christina.
It's not really a question, Daniela. It's just some thoughts. It's because of the COVID. I believe we will have inflation costs time now, even with the recession, because fixed prices can be rated between with the lower demand. So the prices will increase. Mm-hmm. And we are under target inflation. So I think we will have a nightmare, perfect storm with the target inflation, some inflation, cost inflation, and the blindness of our government and the central bank. They will higher the interest rate probably. So I think we are going to a huge crisis, because not because of the COVID, but because of our options, our choices. So I would listen to you soon.
Yeah, so we think that the pass-through will become a problem again, because with cost inflation and so the depreciation will put pressure on the inflation, and then yes. The situation, I'm also pessimistic. I'm not following more so Brazilian situation, because now here we need to, our work is more on lower income developing countries that are facing problems of external debt sustainability, all of this. And really Brazil also, we know the problems, but Brazil is a high income developing country. It's really weird, but it's true. And then
Okay, thank you. We'll take two questions, and that will be it. David and then Paul. And please make it short. Thank you. David?
Thank you for your presentation. I agree with you about your critique of inflation targeting and Louis Philippe and all the many others of us. I wonder, though, what continues to be the rationale for inflation targeting? Like, what is the real motivation for inflation targeting? I'm not talking about a generic, ideological, neoclassical explanation. I'm talking about when, the timing, from an economic historical point of view, and why. Like, what were the inflation issues? I personally think that things like the commodity boom are much overemphasized. Of course, they're financial. There's a lot of papers on that. The actual cost of production in the mining industry, which I follow quite a bit, and in oil and other things, are actually not escalating. So there's issues of economic rent and financialization and so on. But the fundamentals are actually for a commodity for deflation relative to manufacturing and some other prices, certainly rents in urban areas and so on. So what is the view of the Brazilian authorities as to the cause of inflation? Are they fearful of labor contracts, which was partly the case in Canada, for example? Every country has their own specific way it's entered on this inflation targeting, and I would like to know more about Brazil and your critique of it, and what specifically is the argument of the Brazilian authorities for inflation targeting. Otherwise, it becomes simply a doctrine, a religious belief, and nothing to do with the real economy. So I'd like to hear more about this, because I've been concerned, like, the critique of inflation targeting is also becoming generic. We really need to nail it down as to what are the causes, why was it timed, and are the causes at the origin still present today? Thank you.
Then I will answer, and Paulo and Cristina could also join. The adoption of inflation targeting in Brazil and other developing countries happened in the context of the financial crisis of the 90s. So I think that for Brazil and mainly Mexico, Turkey, Argentina is different. They need an option to the managed exchange rate regimes. As what will be the anchor of inflation? So this is the question for these countries, because Brazil, Mexico, Argentina all adopted these fixed or exchange rate bands as a policy for control inflation, as you might know. And with the currency crisis, all of them, so what will be now our anchor? No, the exchange rate, we faced currency crisis. So also in Asia, emerging countries realize that they are very vulnerable to the capital flow cycles, and that they couldn't afford, they couldn't keep the exchange rate managed. So let's adopt inflation target and floating exchange rate regime, but that in fact are dirty floating. And it's interesting because in Brazil, the dirty floating came before the inflation target. So the dirty floating came in January of 1999, was not an option, was the result of the currency crisis. And only in June 1999 that the inflation target was adopted. So at that time, So now we have floating exchange rate. At that time, Brazil had an agreement with the IMF. So this is also important. And Brazil didn't have reserves to rebuild the managed exchange rate regime. So was a result of the crisis, and they adopted inflation target. That is the recommendation. I think that they don't have what will be the alternative. I think we need to think about that. We heterodox, post-Keynesians, but regarding your question, the Brazilian authorities' justifications. So they still saying that the inflation in Brazil is a demand inflation. So they still, supporting this theoretical inflation target regime. So this issue of the role of the exchange rate channel is not recognized. So I don't know if I answer.
Yeah, that helps. I didn't understand quite the beginning part of this. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Just on that point, I've always been very interested in the following. Central bankers and those in central banks have access to all the same data. And we know that for the past 30 years, at least in developed economies, inflation has not been a big concern. So my question is, why do central banks still persist in wanting to inflation target?
Exactly.
And my point is, I'm writing a paper with Guillaume, where we're trying to understand the central banker, because I think that the central banker, if he or she decides not to inflation target, would lose credibility. Not only the central bank would lose credibility, but the central banker herself would lose credibility. So in that sense, it becomes some sort of straitjacket. The central banker who wants to move on beyond the central bank appointment to make millions of dollars in various companies, must have credibility to do so. And I believe that if he or she comes out and says, I don't believe in inflation targeting, inflation is no longer a problem, loses all that a sponsorship money, so to speak. So I think that there's something that we need to understand about the mentality of the central banker in this.
Yes, I agree with you. And I always remember, I would like to say this also to David, but I forgot. I always remember a paper, is a short paper of Keynes that is in the collecting writings, where he mentioned that inflation and depreciation benefit debtors, and deflation and appreciation benefit creditors. So I think I don't have research on that, but I think that the inflation targeting is related with the finance-led capitalism. And this is related with what you said about the credibility. And so I think that all of these are related. And it's not economics, it's political economy discussion.
Economy and stuff.
Yeah.
It's sort of, to use a dirty expression, and I beg forgiveness of the people who are listening, but it's sort of the utility function of the central banker, anyways, I'm not a sociologist. That's why Guillaume is there to help. One last question by Paul. Make it short, Paul, please. And
yeah, I will. I hate to pile on here, but the one thing we haven't been speaking of too much, and I've just been looking at a graph here of Brazil's unemployment rate. And I mean, since 2014, it's doubled. It's now 12.5%. So, I mean, you can talk about currency crisis, you can talk about inflation problems, but you also have an unemployment problem right now. And then you factor in COVID and the disruption of that. And you want to talk about central banker makeup. I mean, that's a third factor you have to consider here. And I don't understand how you can have that kind of an unemployment rate and still be worried about inflation. So that's my point. Just to bring it up, because nobody's talked about the unemployment rate here. And that's since 2014.
Absolutely.
And it was at 6% after many years of being up, 10, and then getting it down to an acceptable, 6% for almost 10 years.
Thank you, Paul.
Okay, now I don't know. Now, what is the figure? Which is the figure for the employment? Now I don't know.
No, unemployment.
Unemployed.
Yeah.
But you mentioned the figure now?
I got it at 2019. The annual was 12.2%.
Yes.
That sound about right? It's from credible website here. So, and I mean, it was in 2014, it was at 6.6% unemployment rate.
Yeah, I think is this.
So I'm sure it's jumped up since COVID. So
now it's higher because I'm not following really the Brazilian statistics, but maybe the thing is Brazil. Other important thing, as you know, we have this high inflation history. Then we are not like German that has this trauma from the hyperinflation, but is really in Brazil have this keep inflation down is really very important, also because this history of high inflation. And we have the other problem is the central banker, and now we have this neoliberal orthodox economy team, and so I think we will still with this inflation targeting for in this government that maybe before. And so I think is and other I think that two problems, the unemployment and the exchange rate, because this is the issue. We talk about stabilization, monetary stabilization, but this is not macroeconomic stabilization. Macroeconomic stabilization, in my view, will be we have a exchange rate stable and competitive. We have a low level of unemployment, and we have a low level of interest rate, and growth. But this is not the goals of the Brazilian economic policy. So I think this is the.
Can I say something, Daniela?
Yeah.
I am not sure if I understood correctly the question, but in Brazil, I think it's also a problem of statistics. It's not about how many jobs we create or the destruction of jobs. It's about people looking for jobs. So they give up of looking for jobs. So this affects directly the statistics. So I think it's another thing. But
yes.
Then,
sure, and the quality of jobs also.
Yes.
The informality, this is also a huge problem.
Okay, thank you. I just want to read a comment by Ivan Velasquez that kind of goes to what I was saying before. He writes, inflation targeting is related to the financiers' high involvement in the central bank boards, since the financial industry benefits from that policy. And that's very interesting, because my inspiration for what I was saying comes from all this PK, post-Keynesian literature on shareholder valuation. And for some reason, nothing's been written about shareholder valuation from the context of a central bank. So anyone who does write a paper on here has to have a footnote saying thank you to Roshan for the idea. But I think there is something there if you want to get into the political economy of central banking. Anyways, I'm just saying.
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Eric Highliner is good on this. Okay, I'll check him out. Thank you, everyone, for this. It was a very interesting debate once again. This brings to a close the webinar series for this book on the future of central banking. Now, many of these topics that we've discussed in the last 5-6 weeks will be the focus of books on their own. So a book on gender, a book on income distribution, a book on etc. And so we look forward to maybe more webinars in the future. I let you know that the next webinars that I'll be organizing is, I believe, August 22nd, but you'll be getting emails about that, is webinars in honor of Mario Schiareccia and Marc Lavoie's long contribution. So make sure that you come and watch it. I'll be sending reminders and all that. Thank you, Christina, Paolo, Daniela, and everyone. Thank you very much, and have a nice summer.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.